So first, I think it's important that you understand what the adrenal glands are. We hear this term adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout. In the medical community, the term adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout is oftentimes laughed at. It's oftentimes considered to be a fallacy or a kind of one of those purple unicorns, so to speak, a thing that doesn't exist that people just kind of make claims that they have. But in reality, adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout is a very, very real issue. And so let's first talk about the adrenal glands themselves. So if we look at this diagram, you can see here the kidneys. On top of your kidneys sit this triangular shaped organ. That's called your adrenal gland. Now it's made out of two major pieces. It's made out of an inner layer. You can see here detailed in pink. That's called the adrenal medulla, and it's made out of an outer layer or cortex, oftentimes referred to as the adrenal cortex. Now, simply put, the adrenal cortex produces some of the hormones of stress, most notably the adrenal cortex, just like its name, cortisol, is responsible for the release of cortisol, whereas the medulla is responsible for adrenaline and noradrenaline. And some people call it epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these are the hormones of acute stress, right? Cortisol, noradrenaline, and adrenaline. And so these glands, these adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys, produce other hormones as well. For example, the mineralocorticoids. We won't get so deep into that tonight, but these help regulate your water and your blood pressure. And then also DHEA, which is a hormone. DHEA stands for dehydroepiandrosterone, and it's a hormone that is a precursor in women, helps to produce estrogen. Progesterone in men helps to produce testosterone, so it's a precursor hormone to those things. So again, cortisol, though, is what we're really going to be talking about tonight with adrenal fatigue and dysfunction. And so what happens, how we go about producing cortisol, because again, these are stress hormones, so it's important that I can't emphasize this enough. These are stress hormones. So the greater the amount of stress that you have, generally speaking, the greater amount of response from these adrenal glands that you're going to get in the form of increased levels of corticosteroids and increased adrenaline, noradrenaline. But the feedback loop, or the message, is actually driven by the brain, to a large extent by the hypothalamus. So in your brain stem here, you have a hormone called corticotropic releasing hormone, and that hormone stimulates the posterior pituitary gland to produce another hormone called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, the word's going to sound confusing, and it's going to get confusing, so I want to simplify this. But my point is this is your brain. Okay, and it's your brain that stimulates the adrenal cortex here. So we've got the adrenal cortex is stimulated to produce glucocorticoids or cortisol, corticosteroids, right? So how do we make sense of that for you? If you've ever had a steroid where you went to the doctor and they gave you a steroid injection because of pain, or they gave you oral steroids because of pain, those are corticosteroids that are generally administered through prescription medication. So the same type of drug, if you will, right? Only your body produces it. A lot of people just don't know that. So when you go to the doctor because you're in pain, you get a corticosteroid. What they're actually doing is giving you high doses of what your body already naturally produces. And so think of cortisol as your body's natural fire truck. It's what your body uses to put out inflammation. It's also what your body uses to mobilize more energy when you're in danger. So cortisol causes several different types of chemical affects, and one of them is, of course, is to elevate your blood glucose or your blood sugar so that your body can take proper action. And another one of the effects is it's an anti-inflammatory. So let's talk next about what can cause adrenal fatigue. Adrenal fatigue is caused by, again, chronic stress being one of the biggest elements to this. But what is stress? If we look at what stress is, it's this word, it's this term that commonly gets used and thrown about. But what exactly is stress? Stress, is it good? Is it bad? I think it's important to have that conversation. So there's good stress, okay? That's oftentimes referred to as hormesis, which is when you have a certain amount of stress that can lead to good things, And so an example of hormetic stress or hormesis would be exercise, right? So if you exercise, the good benefit, right, would be increased muscle mass, strength, increased strength. Exercise also improves blood sugar control, right? So these are all examples of a good effect that stress can bring through exercise. Now, there are bad effects as well. And so an example in this case is if we overtrain, right, you can get injury. Okay, if you work out too aggressively, it can start to disrupt your sleep. It can lead to hyperinflammation and all the consequences of that. So think of stress as being both good and bad. And really, if we want to really think about it, it's a scale, right? On one end and on the other end, you want good stress and you want bad stress to kind of counterbalance each other. You don't want one to be higher than the other, because it's when that happens that we get thrown into this chronic state of stress where overall our bodies start to stimulate the adrenal glands to produce more and more stress hormone, i.e. cortisol, right? So I gave you an example. So chronic stress could be any of these things on this board here, right? So chronic stress could be a chronic infection, right? So one of the things many people are talking about right now is the long C, right? The long viral infection. That's chronic, right? But there are plenty of other examples of chronic infection. There's Lyme disease, is a perfect example of a type of chronic infection. Some people have candida overgrowth or candidiasis that's pervasive, then it's chronic, right? So there are a lot of different examples of how chronic infections can create an overstimulation of the immune system, causing increased stress over time, right? We also have hypoglycemic state, so where this is an example of good and bad stress, because if your blood sugar drops too low, it's good that your body stimulates cortisol release to help dump sugar back into the bloodstream. But if your blood sugars are chronically low all the time, then that's not necessarily good, because too much cortisol can start to create problems. So again, it's about the balance between the good and the bad. We know that chronic inflammation and anything that can cause chronic inflammation can contribute to the adrenal glands being overworked, so to speak. So chronic inflammation, this can be caused by food, it can be caused by chemical exposures, it can be caused by excessive exercise, it can be caused by lack of sleep, it can be caused by dehydration, right? There's just a number of different things that can contribute to chronic inflammatory process. And of course, chronic inflammation can also cause chronic pain, as can other things. So sometimes people get into a state of chronic pain, and again, a number of reasons why that can happen. You could have injury like a lumbar spine problem or a disc injury. You could have a neuropathy or a nerve pain that's chronic. You could have chronic pain like a fibromyalgia type disease, which can contribute to chronic corticosteroid release from your adrenal glands. And then some people, what do? To manage the infection, to manage the inflammation, to manage the chronic pain, they take steroids. And a lot of doctors will prescribe steroids, in my opinion, way too aggressively. They'll prescribe steroids before they look for why these problems exist in many cases. And so steroids are very powerful drugs that can stomp out inflammation, right? Can really help a person's chronic pain level and can mask a person's infection. It doesn't get rid of the infection, but it certainly can mask the inflammation that's produced as a result of the infection. So if you think about this, the chronic infection can create chronic inflammation. Chronic pain is chronic inflammation, right? And all of these are forms of chronic stress, which are commonly, again, medicated with an artificial external corticosteroid that suppresses a person's symptoms and really leaves them in a place where they're hanging, where they're not really fixing the problem, but the drug is very, very powerful. Now, we'll talk more about chronic steroid use in just a minute and the impacts that it can have, but let's talk about some of the other causes of adrenal fatigue first. So gluten sensitivity is one. There's actually a number of research studies that link, there's a type of adrenal insufficiency, and maybe it be important if I clarify the difference there real quick too. Let's make some room. So there's the term adrenal fatigue, and it's not the same as adrenal insufficiency. Insufficiency is actually a medical term, oftentimes referring to as Addison's disease. Now, Addison's disease is an autoimmune condition that leads to hypoadrenalism, or your adrenal glands start to shut down and they're not actually properly producing adequate amounts of stress hormone. This is largely associated with celiac disease, meaning many with celiac disease also have Addison's and vice versa. Many with Addison's also have celiac disease. And one of the prevailing thoughts is that people with Addison's should be investigated whether or not they have celiac disease and embark upon a gluten-free diet. Because if you have Addison's, there are case reports, numerous case reports in medical literature that show that individuals with Addison's going on a gluten-free diet see their Addison's disease improve. And I've seen this actually in my own practice a number of times, where people with prior being diagnosed with Addison's found they were actually able to largely recover their adrenal gland function as a result of going gluten-free. So again, an insufficiency, when you hear this term insufficiency, this really refers more to the Addison's aspect. And if you think about adrenal function in the medical world, right? There's really two types of adrenal dysfunction. One is Addison's and the other is Cushing's. And Cushing's is a little bit different. Cushing's is generally where you make too many adrenal hormones, and Addison's is where you don't make enough. So oftentimes what happens is when people have adrenal dysfunction, they go to the doctor. If you don't fit this definition or this definition, they kind of tell you you don't have a problem with your adrenals, even though you might. So again, just a little bit of clarification there between adrenal insufficiency, which again is more of the medical Addison's aspect, versus adrenal fatigue. Now, other things that can disrupt the adrenal glands and create long-term fatigue, one is nutritional deficits, so poor diet. And we've seen this in numerous occasions, and there are a number of nutrients specifically that are very critical for your body's ability to be able to produce cortisol. And we'll talk about those in just a minute too. And then you have chronic caffeine use, because caffeine as a stimulant will overstimulate over time. It will overstimulate your adrenal glands. So not just caffeine, but other stimulants as well. So if you're on drugs, for ADD or ADHD, some of those stimulant medications, these are things that can really hammer your adrenal glands and work them to death, so to speak. And then you have fast-paced lifestyle. So, in the U.S. today, we're especially guilty of this, eating through lunch, not taking breaks, working, long hours without adequate rest or without adequate recovery time. So that fast-paced lifestyle can be part of this as well. Lack of sunshine, of course, lack of sunshine regulates hormone production, particularly cortisol production. So remember that that cortisol is, as it's produced, is a diurnal hormone. Let me make some room here, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But cortisol is part of how cortisol is produced is through light. It's through predominantly sunlight. And there's a balance between cortisol and melatonin. And when you get, especially morning time sunlight exposure, your body does really better at producing melatonin in adequate quantities to counterbalance cortisol. But if we look at cortisol and melatonin, so cortisol is supposed to be in the morning time. So if this is, AM, and this is lunch, and this is afternoon, and this is night, we look at, where does cortisol, how's cortisol produced? So in the morning time, cortisol is at its highest. Okay, and then as the day goes on, cortisol drops a little bit. And then as we get into the afternoon hours, cortisol drops a little bit more. And then as we get to nighttime, cortisol drops to its lowest point. And so it almost follows like a lazy curve, right? This lazy curve. This is what a cortisol curve looks like. So cortisol is not something that you can go to your doctor and have measured. A lot of times the doctors, they'll measure your cortisol, they'll draw your blood, right? And they'll measure this moment in time right here, but they don't measure these other moments in time. And it's very important to understand because cortisol follows a pattern. If you don't measure the different aspects of that pattern, then you could get a very misleading morning cortisol. It's not uncommon to see morning cortisol be normal, but to see the afternoon cortisol be too high, right? But if you're not measuring it, you never know. So like instead of the curve looking like this, sometimes what we'll see is the curve will look like this, and then it'll actually shoot up. And then it'll kind of drop at night, but it'll still stay high. So like you can get a curve that looks very, very different. And the problem with this is this would be an example of cortisol overall that's too high throughout the course of the day. And why is that a problem? Because when cortisol is high, if you have high cortisol elevates your blood sugar. And this is over time. So if this is happening consistently day in and day out, this is what will happen. It elevates your blood pressure. Okay, and high cortisol over time reduces your muscle. So it actually eats through muscle, and high cortisol over time reduces your bone. That's why if you've ever taken cortisol or gone to your doctor and they prescribed it to you, usually they don't just say, here's cortisol, take it forever. They say, let me give it to you for 10 days. It's something called a measurable dose pack where they'll give it to you in high doses for a short period of time to prevent these types of problems from happening. Because if they gave it to you long term, one of the side effects is this right here. And so a lot of you, maybe you're on corticosteroids, maybe you're on a low dose cortisol-based steroid hormone, because some doctors do this anyway, despite these other risks. And again, then you end up with something like osteoporosis, right? Because we know cortisol elevations over time cause these problems. And so again, going back to if you're just measuring that morning cortisol only and you're not seeing that pattern as it evolves, because another pattern that we'll sometimes see is that cortisol be normal in the morning and then it'll drop, right? And it'll stay lower than what it should. And this is a classic example of a person who is tired all the time. Their cortisol, maybe they wake up and they feel okay, but their cortisol drops to such a great degree over the course of the day, they're tired all the time. Other patterns that we'll sometimes see, again, if you're measuring it in the morning, sometimes we'll also see a pattern where it is low in the morning, and that might be helpful, but again, it's only one reading. And so it'll be low in the morning and it'll spike at noon, and then it'll come down again in the afternoon, and then it'll go up again at night. And so what happens is you're tired in the morning when you're supposed to have energy, and then you're wired at night when you're supposed to be able to go to sleep. And so sometimes we refer to this up-down pattern with cortisol as wired and tired. These individuals, when they're supposed to be energetic, they're not, and when they're supposed to be sleepy, they're not. And so then a lot of times they evolve their mind, if this is happening to them over time, and they think that they're a night person, right? I'm just a night person. That's just who I am. You're not a night person. If this is happening to you, this is very much a hormone disruption, because remember, cortisol keeps your brain awake. That's why it's so important that cortisol drops at night. It allows your brain to fall asleep, and melatonin helps this process. So again, cortisol and melatonin, they really kind of counter each other. So when cortisol is high, melatonin is low, and when cortisol is low, melatonin generally is high. That's the pattern that these two, the dance, or if you will, the weave that these two play with each other. So it's important to understand that cortisol can't just be measured at one slot in the day. And this is, again, I've seen a lot of medical doctors be really guilty of this, and then they just dismiss the patient as not having an issue at all as it relates to their adrenal gland function. So again, stimulants can cause hyperexcretion of cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. Chronic, and I said as well, chronic prescription stimulants, lack of sunshine for that reason. Sunshine balances, helps with melatonin regulation. And then we get lack of sleep. That lack of sleep can really affect how your adrenal glands are capable of functioning. They need that recovery at night. And if you're not sleeping to get that recovery, you're going to develop, long term, you're going to develop this adrenal fatigue issue. So these are all causes. So these are all, what's good about this chart is that you can change any one of these things, right? You have this freedom of choice to do any of the things as it relates to this list. So like if you have a chronic infection, you can make a choice to visit a doctor to get a diagnosis and to get it treated. If you have hypoglycemia, you can make a choice around eating. I hear this all the time. People say, I have hypoglycemia, I have this eating problem. No, you have hypoglycemia probably because you eat like garbage and your blood sugar doesn't know up from down. And if you exercised and you got proper sleep and you regulated your diet with real food, then hypoglycemia wouldn't be something you had. So again, it's one of those things that we can't say I own this disease and I have it and therefore I'm just going to be a victim to it. We have to own why we are struggling with this state. And so this is 100% adjustable. Chronic inflammation, you can find out what the triggers are. There are a number of different triggers to chronic inflammation, food being one of them, chemical exposures being another, microbial imbalance being another, nutritional deficiencies being another. Like those are 4 very common triggers for chronic inflammation. Same thing with chronic pain. Why does the chronic pain exist? Maybe you have an injury that needs to be rehabbed. Maybe your pain is in existence because you don't exercise enough and your muscles have atrophied and they've shrunk and now they're not limber enough, and so you get up to try to move them and they're stiff and you injure yourself, right? So movement and activity for many people is what's necessary to overcome chronic pain. Chronic stress, this can be emotional, right? Some people have emotional stress, and so sometimes you can control that and other times you can't control it as well. And so control it where you can and when you can, otherwise you run into big trouble. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about different types of stress because I think it's an important delineation for you as well. So many of you, we talk about good and bad stress, but what are the types of stress? There's emotional stress, which you can make choices here. You can choose, you can choose who you hang out with. This is a big part of emotional stress, bad relationships or bad symbiotic communication. But there's emotional stress, that's one type. There's physical stress. And for most people, it's not too much exercise as much as it is too little exercise because lack of physical activity is stress. It's just the wrong kind of stress. Because lack of physical activity tells your body to secrete hormones that break your muscle down because you're not using your muscle. And so therefore your body tells itself, we don't need all this muscle, let's deteriorate it and repurpose it and recycle it. And then there's chemical stress. And so physical stress is pretty easy. It's either too much or too little, or it's traumatic injury, right? Those are the primaries of physical. Emotional is generally relationships and spirituality. And then we have chemical stressors, and chemical stressors can be, what are the chemical stressors? Infection, microbial imbalance, nutritional deficiencies, chemical exposures. This could be something like a toxic heavy metal exposure or mold exposure or gluten sensitivity, because food and food reactivity is chemical, right? Because it's something you put in your body that affects you in a good or a bad way, so you get chemical stressors from food. So where most people struggle is right here. Now, a lot of people struggle here too. This oftentimes doesn't require like a super objective analytical chemical analysis. This just requires acknowledgement and addressing. And this just requires acknowledgement and addressing, and sometimes it requires counseling, and sometimes it requires kind of a deeper insight into oneself. But all these things are choices that you can make. You can choose to do counseling. You can choose to move more. You can choose to measure the potential for these things. And therefore, when you're doing that, you're choosing to identify what's causing or contributing to your chronic stress, and then subsequently you can choose to change it and change the outcome, which again, in the case that we're talking about today, is this adrenal fatigue.